So, most people are wondering how Vegas does it. And, you've got the good teams, the bad teams, the mid-range teams. But beyond that, it's kind of a mystery to some people. Doug Upstone, what can you tell us about how Vegas sets futures odds for college football?
Well, Peter, I think the best way to look at this is a very popular guy on Twitter and in a lot of different areas. His name is Todd Furman, and he used to be the odds maker at Caesars. And what he said was very simply, it's based on data, numbers, and the ability to understand the market. So let's cover the first one, which is looking at the numbers. Now, what the odds makers do, and a lot of other sharp handicappers, is they formulate power ratings. So that gives them a fair viewpoint of each particular team coming into the season. Now, you got 128 teams to go over for college football, but as it turns out, in terms of setting actual odds for futures bets, there's only maybe 45 or 50 that actually qualify. And of those, quite honestly, there's no more than, say, 25 to 30 that are bet on in terms of any numbers that matter.
All right, so is it just that they're crunching the numbers, getting their pure power rankings, and then basing the futures off of that, or are they also taking into consideration where they think the betting action is going to come in?
Yeah, well, there's other things that certainly come into play here, Peter. And another one is definitely the data. Looking at these teams, and so the numbers is a very good benchmark to start with, but then you have to look at other things. And and looking at futures or any odds for that matter, is that one of the things that come up is people will often say, well, the odds makers must know something that I don't. But the fact of the matter is, in today's world, Peter, there's so much information that's available on the internet for people to look up. The problem is they don't have the time to do it. And so in this case, you have odds makers or sports books. That's their job. They have to go through, they have to find this data, and that's where they can build in their edge, where the average person just doesn't have the time to go through and try and find it. Now, people like myself, I have the time to go through, dig around, and try and find these things, but this is where they can develop their edge, okay, in setting these numbers to where they're more accurate.
Yeah, and also, the odds makers also have to set futures odds for all these teams, whereas if someone is a particular expert on one team or one conference, which of course we see all the time, those people can have a much better read on those teams than the odds makers do in general, and those people can find value with futures odds as well, right?
Absolutely. If you can, that's a very good point that you make. If you can hone your skills and and just certain conferences or particular teams that you really want to follow, you're definitely going to have an edge ahead of the game, against what these odd makers are trying to do.
Yeah, and the other thing is that Vegas and the sports books expect to take sharp action on their futures odds, expect the lines that are off to get bet by the sharp guys, and they adjust their odds accordingly. And every year there are a handful of teams that do take sharp action on futures odds, like that one year where TCU covered most of their games, and I forgot which year it was, but that year I remember Brent from BetDSI told us in our preview call that he took a ton of sharp action on TCU futures in all ways. That happens every year with a handful of teams, right?
Absolutely, it does. And then the other thing that plays into this also is the public teams. Everybody knows who those are. Those those don't change much. Like this year, we're going to look at Alabama, Clemson, Oklahoma, LSU, Ohio State, and even Michigan. Now, Michigan, to me, though, is the most interesting one here, Peter, because there's a lot of more theory than actually substance of support from a number standpoint on this team, because we've been hearing about Jim Harbaugh. He's in the news all the time, always coming up with different things, and people are buying into what he's doing. Now, I'm not saying he hasn't had a successful run as a coach, but there's a lot of odds makers and sports books that are not, I shouldn't say odds makers, a lot of sports books, though, taking money on Michigan at a pretty significant rate, more than what you'd expect. But the most interesting thing to me about that, if you look at the numbers here, Ohio State, I believe, only has 6 returning starters compared to what Michigan, but yet Michigan, and most every sports book I checked, is right around plus 800 to plus 900, whereas Michigan is consistently 1,200 and up. So that means there's a lot of public money being bet on Michigan at this time, but not influential money, and that's why you have the separation of the two teams.
Yeah, I have heard a lot of opinions, a lot of interest. Some from my own partner here, Mike Brenner, that they like Michigan as a value bet to win the national championship. So the public's taking a lot of action. It's not moving the line yet as much as it would if there were sharp opinions on that. Are there any teams that you've noticed that are taking notable sharp action on their futures odds?
Well, the one that keeps popping up, let's just say from circles that I run into, is Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting to me about them because they're a little lower down the list. Now, there's no question they're a public team. They were in the Final Four last year, of the college football championship. But yet you're just not hearing a lot about them at this point. Now, I don't know if it's the Big 12. I'm not really sure what it is. But, I mean, this team is pretty much loaded, to come back. Their schedule, if anything, is easier this year because the Big 12 is weaker. And then, we got some stuff with Baylor going on that makes them a weaker team then also. So they're essentially, in my mind, they're a prohibitive favorite. And, well, you can get into that championship round. I think, they can certainly do stuff. So at plus 1,200, I think there's some, pretty good value taking Oklahoma at this point.
Yeah, well, I think I can answer that. I mean, the reason I wouldn't bet Oklahoma on a futures bet is because if Baker Mayfield is such a big part of what their offense does, and if he goes down, there's not a lot of depth behind him. My sense is that when betting futures odds, that injuries and depth is the key factor there. And any team that has a strong offense, but with a quarterback or one player who's essential to it, and if that guy goes down, the offense might fall apart. That's a team I wouldn't want to bet on in terms of futures odds. Teams I would want to bet on are teams that maybe aren't as predicated on the health, on maintaining the health of one or a small amount of players.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, depth certainly plays a part of this, and like certain programs that are that can continue to roll over and over. I mean, again, Ohio State, I just mentioned, that with so few starters back, but nobody's expecting a dramatic drop off for Ohio State this upcoming year because the presumption is that Urban Meyer, along with the players that are coming, are going to be good. They might be a little untested early in the year, but later on, we'll find out more about them. So yeah, I still do like Oklahoma. I understand your point about, predicated on one player.
Yeah.
Thing is though, if he gets hurt, but what happens if he doesn't? That's kind of my point.
All right, Doug. Well, it's certainly interesting to think about and to speculate on. Are there any other final thoughts you'd like to leave us with before we wrap this up?
Sure, Peter. The other thing I said, the best thing that anybody that can do to go against a sports book is to have complete preparation. Because the sports books can set the odds, they can set the numbers, they can do everything. But if a person is prepared and knows everything that they can about a particular team to make a futures wager, that's going to be the best ammunition against any sports book.
Sounds good. Doug Upstone, thanks so much for talking with us. I look forward to covering football with you all season long.
Always on the go? Bet365 has one of the top mobile platforms in today's market. Sign up today and don't let your busy life keep you out of the game.